What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected and outspoken actors walks into what is supposed to be a routine morning show interview, only to find himself sitting across from a host who seems quietly determined to challenge him on live television? What unfolds next is not just an awkward exchange, but a moment that sparks heated debate among viewers, divides public opinion, and leaves one burning question hanging in the air: who really crossed the line? Before we get into the heart of this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us which side you think was right, because this one is guaranteed to split people right down the middle. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this plays out. It was supposed to be just another promotional appearance. Samuel L. Jackson had a new film coming out, and like clockwork, his publicist had arranged the usual lineup of press interviews, morning shows, late-night appearances, friendly conversations designed to build buzz and remind audiences why he remains one of the most respected figures in the industry. Nothing unusual, nothing controversial, just business. Good Morning America was first on the schedule. Jackson arrived at the studio early that morning, calm and professional, greeting producers and crew members with his signature mix of confidence and warmth. He'd done this countless times before. Decades in Hollywood had taught him how these things worked: where to sit, when to smile, how to steer a conversation back on track if it wandered too far. He was prepared for a smooth discussion about the film, the cast, the director's vision, and maybe a light-hearted anecdote or two, but the moment he stepped onto the set, something felt off. When he sat down across from Michael Strahan, Jackson sensed a tension he couldn't immediately explain. Strahan's smile, usually effortless and inviting, felt unusually tight, almost rehearsed. Their handshake lingered just a fraction of a second too long, not aggressive, not friendly either, but measured, as if Strahan was silently assessing him, sizing him up. Samuel L. Jackson had spent his entire career reading people. He could tell when a scene partner was holding something back, when a director was uneasy, when an interviewer had an angle they hadn't disclosed. And right now, every instinct he had was telling him this interview wasn't going to be as straightforward as promised. "Samuel L. Jackson, welcome back to Good Morning America," Strahan said, his voice full of that polished morning show enthusiasm viewers had come to expect. Jackson smiled politely, but he caught something underneath the tone, a faint edge, almost imperceptible but unmistakable to someone with his experience. It was enough to make him adjust his posture, sitting up straighter, more alert. "Good to be here, Michael," Jackson replied, crossing his legs and settling in. His expression was calm, but his mind was already working. He'd walked into interviews far more hostile than this, and come out just fine. Still, something told him to stay sharp. "So, let's talk about your new film," Strahan continued, glancing briefly at his notes. "That was expected. That was safe territory. But first," Strahan added, pausing just long enough for the shift to register, "I think our viewers would be interested in hearing about some of the comments you made recently about the industry. You've been pretty vocal about certain issues." The atmosphere changed instantly. Jackson's eyebrows lifted slightly, not in anger, but in surprise. This wasn't the plan. His publicist had gone over the talking points in detail with the producers. Every question had been agreed upon. The focus was supposed to remain on the film, its themes, the performances, the creative process behind it, not industry politics, not commentary, not controversy. For a split second, Jackson considered deflecting the question entirely. He could laugh it off, redirect, keep things light. But there was something about the way Strahan had framed the question, careful, deliberate, almost loaded, that made it clear this wasn't a casual detour. This was intentional. The studio. Lights felt brighter. The silence between them stretched just a beat longer than normal. Jackson glanced briefly toward the camera, then back at Strahan, his expression thoughtful but guarded. He understood what was happening now. The interview wasn't just about promoting a film anymore. It had become a test. Strahan waited, composed, giving Jackson space to respond, yet the pause itself felt like pressure. Viewers at home may not have noticed it, but inside the studio, the tension was unmistakable. Crew members shifted slightly. Producers exchanged glances off camera. Whatever Jackson said next would set the tone for everything that followed. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone watching, this was no longer a routine morning show appearance. It was the beginning of an exchange that would leave audiences debating long after the cameras stopped rolling. Here is a long-form expansion, around 1,000 words of your paragraph in English, written in the same dramatic YouTube narration style and smoothly continuing the tension of the interview. I've kept the tone cinematic, balanced, and engaging for viewers. What followed felt like a clear departure from the carefully agreed-upon script. For a brief moment, the studio seemed to hold its breath. Samuel L. Jackson understood instantly that this was no longer a simple promotional interview. Still, he chose his words with precision, the way a seasoned professional does when he knows millions are watching. "Well, Michael," Samuel L. Jackson said carefully, his voice calm but deliberate, "I've always been honest about my experiences in this business. I think it's important to speak truthfully about the challenges we face, not just as performers, but as people." It was a measured response, thoughtful, respectful, exactly the kind of answer you'd expect from someone who had spent decades navigating Hollywood's shifting landscape. Right, Michael Strahan nodded, leaning back slightly in his chair. But his expression told a different story. There was something in the way he said it, too quick, too dismissive, that signaled dissatisfaction. His smile remained fixed, television perfect, but his eyes suggested he wasn't done pushing. "But some people might say," Strahan continued, carefully choosing his words, "that when you're as successful as you are, when you've had the kind of career you've had, maybe it's time to, focus on the positive, instead of always bringing up the negative aspects." The question didn't sound aggressive on the surface. In fact, to a casual viewer, it might have seemed reasonable. But in the studio, the tension was unmistakable. The phrasing carried an implication that Jackson's honesty was unnecessary, perhaps even ungrateful. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Jackson felt his jaw tighten, just slightly. A muscle flexed along his cheek before he relaxed it again. Years of experience had taught him when to react and when not to. He had faced hostile critics, dismissive executives, and far tougher crowds than this. A morning show host wasn't about to rattle him. Still, he wasn't going to let the implication slide. "I'm sorry," Jackson said, tilting his head just a fraction, his tone still even, still controlled. "Are you suggesting that speaking honestly about important issues is somehow inappropriate?" The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. His voice didn't rise. He didn't sound angry, but there was now an edge, sharp, polished, unmistakably intentional. Anyone who truly knew Jackson could hear it immediately. This wasn't defensiveness. This was a line being drawn. "Because," he continued, "I was under the impression that this conversation was supposed to be about my film, not my personal philosophy on social commentary." The studio lights reflected off the polished desk between them as the silence stretched again. For a split second, Strahan seemed to study Jackson more closely, as if reassessing his approach. Then he leaned forward in his chair. "Hey, I'm just saying what some people out there are thinking," Strahan replied smoothly, his smile never wavering, but now his eyes were sharper, more focused. "You've built this reputation as someone who doesn't hold back." Jackson remained still, his hands resting calmly on his knee. "But sometimes," Strahan added, pausing deliberately, "viewers wonder if maybe you're being a little too, how should I put this, aggressive in your approach to certain topics." That word, aggressive, landed hard. Jackson didn't react immediately. Instead, he took a slow breath, letting the moment breathe. The accusation wasn't new. He'd heard it before, in different forms, from different people, often coded, often carefully disguised, and he knew exactly what it meant. Around them, the energy in the studio shifted. Crew members froze in place. Producers off-camera exchanged uneasy looks. This was no longer light morning television. This was something else entirely. Jackson finally spoke. "See, that's interesting," he said calmly. "Because when someone speaks passionately, honestly, and without apology, that's often labeled as aggressive. But when others do the same thing, it's called being bold, or outspoken, or courageous. His gaze never left Strahan's. I don't raise my voice. I don't insult people. I talk about my lived experiences. If that makes some people uncomfortable, that doesn't mean the conversation shouldn't happen. Strahan's smile flickered for the first time, just a fraction of a second, but enough to notice. I'm just playing devil's advocate here, he said quickly, attempting to soften the moment. This is a morning show. Some viewers might feel like they tune in for positivity. Jackson nodded once. And positivity doesn't disappear just because we acknowledge reality, he replied. In fact, ignoring real issues doesn't make them go away. It just makes them harder to fix. The exchange had crossed a point of no return. At home, viewers leaned closer to their screens. Social media feeds began lighting up in real time. Some praised Jackson for standing his ground with dignity. Others questioned whether the interview had gone too far off script. And sitting there under the bright studio lights of Good Morning America, it was clear this wasn't just about a film anymore. It was about who gets to speak, who gets questioned, and who gets labeled for doing so. Here is a full long-form expansion, 1,000 words of your paragraph in English, written in a cinematic high-tension YouTube narration style and continuing seamlessly from the previous segment. I've preserved the escalation, authority, and psychological battle while keeping it compelling for viewers. Do you really think the people watching this show right now are incapable of handling honest conversations about real issues? Samuel L. Jackson didn't raise his voice, but the question landed with undeniable force. His gaze was steady, unblinking. Do you think they're too simple to understand that an actor can entertain them and have opinions about the world around them? The question caught Michael Strahan off guard. For just a fraction of a second, the polished television composure slipped. The smile faltered. The rhythm he was used to controlling suddenly escaped him. That's not what I'm saying at all, Strahan replied quickly, attempting to recover. Then what exactly are you saying? Jackson pressed, leaning forward now, his body language signaling that this conversation had crossed into something far more serious. Because from where I'm sitting, Jackson continued, it sounds like you're suggesting I should keep my mouth shut about things that matter to me. Smile, wave, and just talk about how great everything is. Is that the kind of interview you want to conduct here? Strahan opened his mouth. I just think... But Jackson wasn't finished. No, Jackson said firmly, his voice rising just enough to command attention without slipping into anger. Let me finish. The studio fell silent. I've been doing this for over 30 years, Jackson continued. I've worked with some of the greatest directors in this business. I've been part of films that have moved people, challenged people, and entertained people. And in all that time, I have never once apologized for having opinions or for speaking my mind. He paused, letting the words settle. So if that makes me aggressive in your book, he said calmly, then I guess we have very different definitions of that word. The tension in the studio was no longer subtle. It was thick, heavy. Producers behind the cameras exchanged frantic looks, clearly debating whether to cut to commercial. This was veering dangerously close to becoming a live television nightmare, yet neither man appeared willing to back down. Look, Sam, Strahan said, and the casual use of the shortened name immediately changed the temperature in the room. It was subtle, but deliberate. I respect your career. I really do, Strahan continued. But sometimes I think you forget that not everyone sees the world the way you do. Some people just want to hear about the movie without all the extra commentary. Jackson's eyes narrowed. Sam? He repeated quietly. We're on Sam terms now. That's interesting. He leaned back slightly, his expression sharpening rather than softening. And let me get this straight, Jackson continued. You think people are too fragile to handle a conversation that goes beyond surface-level promotion? You think your viewers are that shallow? I think my viewers appreciate honesty, Strahan shot back. And honestly, sometimes it feels like you're more interested in making points than connecting with people. Making points, Jackson repeated, his voice dropping into a dangerous quiet. Now the room truly froze. Every film I make, Jackson said slowly, every role I take, every interview I give is about connecting with people. The difference is, I don't treat people like children who can't handle complex thoughts. He gestured lightly toward the camera. I give them credit for being intelligent human beings, people who can appreciate entertainment and substance. The live audience sat in stunned silence. This was no longer a celebrity interview. It had become a philosophical battleground. One man defending the right to be multidimensional, the other struggling to reassert control over a segment slipping through his fingers. The audience could feel it. Something significant was unfolding, but no one yet realized how much worse it was about to get. Sensing that he was losing control of the interview, Strahan changed tactics. Instead of backing down, he leaned into the confrontation, apparently believing that pushing harder might help him regain the upper hand. "You know what, Samuel?" Strahan said, emphasizing the full name now, clearly attempting to sound more respectful after being called out. "I've been doing television for a long time, too. I've interviewed a lot of celebrities." Jackson remained expressionless. "Most of them understand that there's a time and place for everything," Strahan continued. "When you come on a morning show, people are having their coffee, they're getting ready for work. They want something light, something positive." Jackson responded instantly. "So now you're the authority on what people want?" he asked sharply. "You've decided that the viewers of this show are incapable of engaging with anything more substantial than fluff pieces and weather reports?" "That's not what I said," Strahan replied defensively. "But that's exactly what you implied," Jackson shot back. "And frankly, it's insulting. Not to me, but to your audience." The studio lights glared down on the two men as the standoff continued. The producers were now clearly panicking. This was live television, and control had slipped away completely. Sitting there under the bright lights of Good Morning America, it was painfully clear that the interview had gone somewhere no one had planned. This wasn't about a movie anymore. It was about respect, about voice, about whether public figures are allowed to be fully human, or only useful when they stay silent. And as the tension reached a boiling point, one thing became certain. Whatever happened next was going to leave a mark. Across the desk, Michael Strahan's jaw tightened. The easygoing morning show demeanor was gone now, replaced by something far more defensive. "Look," Strahan said firmly, "I know you think you're making some kind of profound point here, but this is Good Morning America. This isn't a philosophy class. People tune in for entertainment and information, not to be lectured." "Lectured?" Jackson repeated, his voice rising just slightly. The studio audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even without shouting, the tension was unmistakable. "Michael," Jackson continued, "having an opinion and expressing it thoughtfully isn't lecturing. It's called being a human being. But apparently in your world, celebrities are supposed to be nothing more than trained seals, clapping and barking on command whenever you want them to promote something." He shook his head slowly. "That's ridiculous, and you know it. That's not fair," Strahan shot back, his own voice beginning to rise now. "I've had thousands of guests on this show. Most of them managed to have a conversation without turning everything into some kind of political statement or social commentary." Jackson leaned back in his chair. Anyone familiar with his films recognized the expression crossing his face. It was the same look he wore right before delivering some of his most unforgettable lines. The calm before the storm. "Political statement," Jackson repeated slowly. "Michael, when did talking about treating people with respect become political? When did suggesting that audiences are intelligent become controversial?" He leaned forward again, eyes locked on Strahan. "You're the one who steered this interview in this direction. I came here to talk about my film. Remember that?" "And we can still do that," Strahan replied quickly, but his tone betrayed him. He had no intention of letting this go. "But first," he added, "I think we need to address the elephant in the room. A lot of people feel like you've become too comfortable using your platform to push your personal agenda." "My personal agenda?" Jackson repeated, his voice now edged with the kind of intensity that had made him legendary for playing characters who never backed down from anyone. And what agenda would that be exactly? For the first time, Strahan seemed to realize he might have stepped into dangerous territory, but instead of retreating, he pressed on. "I mean," Strahan said, choosing his words carefully. "You're constantly talking about inequality, about how the industry treats certain people differently, about social issues that some people think should be kept separate from entertainment." "Some people think that, do they?" Jackson asked quietly. Anyone familiar with his work knew that quieter was worse. "Michael," Jackson continued, his voice dropping to a controlled, razor-sharp calm, "let me ask you something." The studio fell completely silent. "Do you really believe stories exist in a vacuum?" he asked. "Do you think the films people love, the characters they connect with, the performances that move them, do you think those come from nowhere?" Strahan didn't answer. "Because everything we create," Jackson went on, "comes from lived experience, pain, joy, struggle, growth. When I talk about inequality, I'm not pushing an agenda, I'm acknowledging reality." He gestured lightly toward the camera. "And the idea that entertainment has to be empty to be enjoyable, that's an insult to the people watching at home." Strahan exhaled sharply. "I'm not saying entertainment has to be empty," he replied. "I'm saying there's a balance, and sometimes it feels like you're more interested in making statements than telling stories." Jackson's lips pressed together briefly. "Every statement I make is part of the story," he said, "whether it's on screen or in an interview. The difference is, I don't believe in pretending everything's fine just to make people comfortable." The tension in the studio had reached a breaking point. Producers behind the cameras were now openly gesturing, whispering urgently, trying to decide whether to cut to commercial or let the moment play out, but neither man was willing to give an inch. "You're acting like I'm trying to silence you," Strahan said. "That's not the case." "Then stop framing honesty as a problem," Jackson replied instantly. "Stop suggesting that people can't handle complexity, because that says more about how you see them than how I do." The live audience sat, frozen, aware they were witnessing something that would be replayed, debated, and dissected long after the broadcast ended. This was no longer a celebrity interview gone off script. It was a collision of two fundamentally different philosophies, one that believed audiences should be protected from discomfort, and one that believed audiences deserved respect. Strahan straightened in his chair, clearly aware that control had slipped from his grasp. "Well," he said stiffly, "we're clearly not going to agree on this." "No," Jackson replied, calmly. "But that's the point. Disagreement isn't dangerous. Pretending it doesn't exist is." The camera lingered on both men, the silence stretching uncomfortably long. And sitting there under the unforgiving studio lights of Good Morning America, it was obvious to everyone watching. This interview had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. What happened next wouldn't just define the segment, it would define the conversation that followed, and Jackson wasn't done yet.